there is this meeting, September 1938. So Chamberlain made 3 trips to meet with Hitler.
Yeah.
Which culminated in the Munich conference.
Yeah, on the 30th of September, yeah.
Where was Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini, and Daladier, Prime Minister of France. They met to discuss essentially Czechoslovakia without any of the government officials of Czechoslovakia participating. And Hitler promised to make no more territorial conquest, and Chamberlain believed him.
He chose to believe him, I think, is the thing, is the point. So it's very interesting. So Chamberlain gets a very bad press.
Uh-oh.
Well, no, I'm not. No, it's not really It's I just think there's too much retrospective view on this.
Right.
And that's fine, because the whole point of history is you can look back and you can judge decisions that were made at a certain point through the prism of what subsequently happened, which of course the people that are making the decisions at the time can't, because they're in that particular moment. So I don't think Chamberlain did trust Hitler, but he wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt. Britain was not obliged to Czechoslovakia at all. France was. France had signed a treaty with Czechoslovakia in 1924. But Britain had not. So there was no obligation at all for Britain to do this. The only reason why Britain would go to war over Czechoslovakia is because of the threat of Nazism and what the ramifications of not going to war with him. But the problem is that Chamberlain's interesting, because in 1935 he was Chancellor of Exchequer, and when they started to sort of think, okay, we really do need to rearm, he was very much in favor of substantially expanding and rehabilitating the Navy, so updating existing battleships and so on, and also developing the Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
There's not really much argument for having a large army, because if you have a large army, you've got to maintain it. Britain is a small place. Where do you put them? You've also got to transport them. That's complicated. You've got to train them. You've got to put them in barracks. You've got to feed them, all this kind of stuff. There's a kind of sort of impracticality about having a large army. Whereas navies are great because you can keep them at sea and they can be, on the water. Air Force is slightly different. Air power is viewed in very much the same way that naval power is viewed. That we're an island nation. We have a global assets, and air power gives us the flexibility that an army doesn't. So he is all for backing the expansion of the army, of the Air Force and the Navy in the 1930s. Then he subsequently becomes Prime Minister and sticks to his guns on that. It is he that enables the Air Force and the Air Ministry to develop the first fully coordinated air defense system anywhere in the world. There is not an air defense system in Poland, nor Norway, nor Denmark, nor the Netherlands, nor Belgium, nor France. There is in Britain. Britain is the only one. And frankly, it pays off big time in the summer of 1940. So you have to give him credit for that. Britain, interestingly, is also the world's leading armaments exporter in the 1930s, which is amazing, really, when you think everyone complains about the fact that we weren't rearming enough. Actually, we were. When we had all the infrastructure there and we were expanding that infrastructure dramatically. I say we, I'm only saying that because I'm British. So they were doing that. But in 1938, Britain wasn't ready for war. Now, you can argue that Germany wasn't ready for war either. But Chamberlain was Prime Minister in a democracy, a parliamentary democracy, where 92% of the population were against going to war in 1938. There is not a single democratic leader in the world that would go against the wishes of 92% of the population. Now, you could say, well, he should have just argued it better and presented his case better and all the rest of it. But at that point, there was no legal obligation to go to the defense of Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was another of these new nations that had been created out of 1919 in the Versailles Treaty. Who was to say, we in Britain are able to judge the rights and wrongs of that, how fantastic it would be to go to war with a nation a long way away for people whom we know very little, et cetera, et cetera. I'm paraphrasing his quote. But I'm not saying it was the right decision. I'm just saying I can see why in September 1938, he is prepared to give him the chance. Now, I do think he was a bit naive. And what he also does is this really interesting thing. Is he goes over to Hitler's flat, completely ambushes him, goes to his flat on the afternoon of 30th of September and says to Hitler, look, I've drawn up this agreement here. And this is to continue the the naval agreement that we've already made. And by signing this, you are saying that Germany and Britain should never go to war with one another. And it goes, yeah, well, whatever, signs it.
Yeah.
Chamberlain comes back, lands at End and waves his little piece of paper, peace in our time and all the rest of it, which obviously comes back to bite him in a very big way. But it's interesting that when Hitler then subsequently goes and moves in, that France and Britain decide in rather the same way that there's been discussion about deciding that large portions of Ukraine should just be handed over to Russia without consulting Ukraine a few weeks ago. It is incredible, I think, that France and Britain and Italy with Germany are deciding that, yes, it's fine for Germany to go in and take the Sudetenland, without really consulting the Czechs. It's a sort of similar kind of scenario, really. And it's equally wrong. But when Germany does then go and take over the whole of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, that's the bottom line. That's the point where Chamberlain goes, okay, I've given him the benefit of the doubt. No more benefits of the doubt. That's it. That is, he's crossed the line. And so you reinforce your agreement with Poland and you do a formal agreement. You go, okay, we will uphold your sovereignty. If you are invaded, we will go to war with you. And that is a ratcheting up of diplomacy and politics in a very, very big way. And it is that decision to make a treaty with the Poles is not heeded by Hitler, but it's heeded by literally every one of his commanders. And it's also heeded by Goering, who is his number two and who is obviously the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe and is president of Prussia and all the rest of it, and is the second most senior Nazi. And he's going, this is a catastrophe. This is the last thing we want to be doing, is going to war against Britain and indeed France.
The Munich conference is a pretty interesting moment, I would say, in all of human history, because you got the leaders of these bigger-than-life nations in the most dramatic brewing conflict in human history. Yeah, Chamberlain, Hitler, Mussolini, and Daladier. It's interesting when these bigger-than-life leaders are in a room together. Is there something that you know about their interactions?
Yeah, I think I think one of the things that's interesting is that Hitler's got home advantage because it's on his turf. And, to start off with, the first meeting is at the Berghof, his beloved place in the Obersalzberg overlooking Berchtesgaden in the Alps. So he's pretty confident because this is my manor, this is my turf, I'm not going to be bossed around by these guys. But Chamberlain, for example, is going there thinking, I've been around the blocks. No one can teach me anything. I've been a politician for ages. I'm not going to be kind of cowed out by this sort of, Austrian upstart. So they're both coming at it with a kind of sort of slight kind of superiority kind of complex. Interestingly, when you get to the actual meetings at the Bernabeu in Munich a couple of weeks later, Chamberlain is cheered by the crowds when his car comes in, when he goes to his hotel, when he's moving from his hotel to the Bernabeu. There are crowds cheering him, waving Union Jacks, all this kind of stuff. Hitler does not like that at all. Not at all. Puts him on the back foot. And that's because the German people don't want war. In the same way that the British people don't want war, nor do the German people. Yeah. The difference is that Hitler is a dictator and an autocrat and has the devotion of the people. So he can do what he wants in a way that Chamberlain can't. Chamberlain's hands are tied because he is an elected prime minister, an elected leader, political leader, and he's not head of state. So there is no question that it is Hitler and Chamberlain that are the top dogs in this particular discussion. Daladier takes a back seat. Even Mussolini, although he's there, he doesn't want war either. He wants to be left alone to do his own thing without anyone getting in the way, but he doesn't want to sort of, it's not in his interest to have a European war. So he's trying to avoid it. So it is really, you see that the kind of alpha males in the room are Chamberlain and Hitler. And it's really interesting because Hitler's got this sort of slightly garrulous voice and very kind of pale blue eyes and such distinct features, quite a long nose. And, he always says this is why he has the moustache, is to kind of, disguise the big nose. So as I was saying to you earlier on before we started recording, he does have a sense of humor. It's maybe not one that you and I would kind of tap into, but he does have one. Whereas Chamberlain is just sort of, he sounds like a sort of, a bit like an old man, he's sort of silver haired and he looks like your sort of archetypal kind of British gentleman with his rolled up umbrella and his, and his Homburg hat and all the rest of it. So they're both sort of caricatures in a funny sort of way. And yet the consequence of these discussions, these great events happening, you're absolutely going, either which way the Munich crisis comes out, you're taking a step closer to war. It's just whether the war is going to happen kind of next week or whether it's going to happen a year hence. But it's, the Munich crisis obviously doesn't stem the inevitability of war at all. It just heightens it.
Do you think there are words that Chamberlain should have said, could have said, that put more pressure on Hitler, intimidate Hitler more?
Yeah, it's a really tricky one. It's such a difficult one because you're always looking at it through, the enemy has a vote and you don't know what that vote is going to be and you don't know what it's going to look like. There's no question that Europe, the rest of Europe is cowed by the kind of impression of military might that the Germans have put out. They certainly fear they are stronger than they actually are. And then on the other hand, they're also going, yeah, but Germany doesn't have natural resources, doesn't have access to the world's oceans. It's kind of, it shouldn't be able to win a war, and so they're kind of contradicting themselves at the same time. So in 1 minute they're sort of going, oh god, you don't want to take on all those Nazis and all those swastikas and those automaton stormtroopers. But on the other hand, they're then saying, but actually Germany doesn't have much in its kind of, in its basket. It's got actually quite a lot of weaknesses and we should be able to kind of prevail, blah, blah, blah. We'll just impose an economic blockade and then it'll be stuffed. And Britain is not ready to fight a war in 1938, but nor is Hitler, nor is Germany. So, one is sort of striking out the other. But it's very easy to say that in hindsight. But at the time, with people kind of digging trenches in Hyde Park in the centre of London and barrage balloons going up over London and, children being evacuated from the cities and 92% of the population not wanting to go to war, you can see why he takes the course he does. I suppose that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's necessarily the right decision, but I think it's an understandable decision.
Oh, but what about even just on the human level? If I go into a room with a British gentleman versus going to a room with Trump, it feels like it's so much easier to read and manipulate the British gentleman because Trump is like Trump-like characters. It seems like Hitler is similar, Churchill is similar. It's like this guy can do anything. There's something terrifying about the
unpredictability.
Yeah. It feels like there's something very predictable about Chamberlain.
Yes, I think that's true. But also one has to take a step back and think about what Britain represents, so therefore what Chamberlain represents in 1938. Britain has the largest empire the world has ever known in 1938.
We shouldn't forget that.
A third of the world is pink, as the saying goes, and that saying comes from the kind of atlas of the world where all British territories are kind of coloured pink.
Yeah.
And on top of that, it has lots of extra imperial territories as well. So, if you look at there's this incredible map of global shipping in 1937. And there's these little antlines of ships going out. And one of the strongest antlines is going down to Argentina and South America from Britain. So down past West Africa and down the Southern Atlantic, and there it is. And that's because Britain owns most of Argentina. It owns huge, great farming estates and ranches. It owns the railway system. It owns many of the port facilities. So you didn't even need an empire. You just need the facilities that overseas trade and possessions can give you. And Britain not only has the largest navy, it also has the largest merchant navy. It has 33% of the world's merchant shipping and access to a further 50%, Greek, Norwegian, Canadian shipping that it can access. So if you've got access to in excess of 80% of the world's shipping, that puts you in an incredibly strong position. And actually, all sorts of other things have been going on. While they might not have been creating a huge army or producing enough Spitfires that they might want to up until this point, what they have also been doing is stockpiling bauxite and copper and tungsten and huge reserves. And because Britain has this huge global reach, and because it has its empire and its extra imperial assets, it can strike bargains that no one else can strike. So it can go into various countries around the world and can go, okay, I want you to guarantee me for the next 5 years every bit of your rubber supply. I will pay over the asking price to secure that. And it's doing that in the 1930s. So when war comes, it's got everything it possibly needs. Now, you always need more because it's suddenly turning into a kind of, a proper global, long, drawn-out war. But that is a huge advantage. So it is with that mindset that Chamberlain is going into those talks and thinking, okay, well, I'm not going to go to war over the Czechoslovakian. Who cares about them? But I am going to show Hitler that I mean business. Hitler's going, who's this stuffy guy with his white hair? I don't give a toss about him, and he's coming at it from a completely different perspective. And I think one of the things that's so interesting from a dramatic point of view and from a historian's point of view, or even a novelist's point of view, in the case of Robert Harris writing his book about these negotiations, which I don't know if you've read it, but it's terrifically good. Is the fact you've got two alpha males, who are going to those negotiations from totally different perspectives and vantage points. And I think it's very easy for people today to forget how elevated Britain was in the late 1930s. The gold standard was tied to the pound, not the dollar. And so Britain was the number one nation in the world at that time. And it just was. And it's so diminished by comparison today that it's hard to imagine it. And I think one of the interesting things about the historiography, about the narrative of how we tell World War II, is that so much of it has been dictated by the shift in power that took place subsequent to 1945. And when people were starting to write these sort of major narratives in the 1970s and 80s and into the 1990s, is through a prism of a very, very different world. And so one of the reasons why you have this narrative that Britain was a bit rubbish and hanging on the shirt tails of the Americans, and all the blood was spilt in Eastern Front, and Germany had the best army in the world and was only defeated because Hitler was mad and blah blah blah. That kind of sort of traditional narrative. It's that narrative emerges through the prism of what was going on in the 1970s and what was going on in the 1980s and the changing world, rather than looking at it through the prism of the late 1930s or early 1940s.
Still, there is this moment of decision. When do you think, what lesson do you take from that? When is the right time for appeasement, to negotiate, for diplomacy, and when is the right time for military strength, offensive, attacking, for military conflict? Where's that line? Where's that?
Well, I kind of think it probably was when it was. I mean,
Poland.
Yeah. Honestly, I'm not sure it would have been the right decision to go to war in 1938. I think it would. I can't predict, because you can't second guess how things are going to play out, because you just don't know. But I'm not sure that Chamberlain made the wrong decision. I'm not saying he made the right decision. I'm just like, I'm being a bit wishy-washy about this.
You could have threatened it more. Imagine Churchill in those same meetings.
Yeah, but Churchill also appeases. I mean, he appeases Stalin all the time. I mean, so the idea that Churchill's this big, strong man and never appeases, and, he's gung-ho for war. Churchill's out of the government at that time. He recognizes that you can't trust Hitler. He recognizes that Nazism is bad. But because he's out of the government, he doesn't have a window on exactly where Britain is at that particular time in a way that Chamberlain does. So I suppose what I'm saying is Chamberlain is better placed to make those decisions than Churchill is, which again doesn't mean that Chamberlain is right and Churchill is wrong. It's just, that's a massive pump to go to war in 1938 when you still don't have, you've got a handful of Spitfires, you've got a handful of Hurricanes, you haven't got enough, your air defense system isn't properly sorted at this point. Your Navy is strong. But, what's that going to look like? I mean, if you do go to war. Because it's not going to be armies sweeping into Germany. It's going to be accelerated industrialization for a year. So, no, even if you go to war in 1938 over Czechoslovakia will not be saved. France and Britain will not be going and invading Germany. That is absolutely not going to happen. So, sort of, what's the point? I mean, if you're not going to do that, why didn't you accelerate your rearmament thereafter? Get your ducks in a row. And then you can consider it. I mean, after all, even in September 1939, they don't really do anything. I mean, we talked about the Saar offensive, which isn't really an offensive at all. It's firing one round of machine gun and scuttling back again. But I mean, they don't even do that then. They're still buying time in 1939. And, Britain is only just about ready to take on the onslaught of the Luftwaffe in summer of 1940.
Well, nobody's ready for war.
No, and you always want more than you've got at any time, even when you're winning.
But really not ready. Even like you mentioned with Barbarossa, Nazi Germany is really not ready.
Not ready.
Nobody's really except France. I swear,
France have radios.
Fine, but come on. When Nazi Germany invades Poland, I mean,
yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible. Because I also do think that had France gone in some force with some British troops as well, had they gone in, what would have happened is that would have that easily could have brought down Hitler, because most of his senior commanders are just thinking, what the hell is going on? This is a catastrophe. I mean, to a man. I mean, even Goering is thinking this is a terrible idea. They are absolutely not convinced. And when Hitler does his big talk to he asks all his senior commanders to come to the Berghof to brief them about the invasion of Poland. It's just after the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact of the 22nd of August. He calls them all to the Berghof and says, come in mufti, come in civilian suits. They all turn up and he gives them this kind of huge, great speech. And says, this is the moment. This is the time. This is what we're going to do. And they're all going, what? You're kidding me. What, we're going to Poland on the 26th of August? That's the plan? Like 2 days' time? Where's the plan? Where's the whole point is that, they're emerging and growing militarily, but they were supposed to have all these exercises where they, coordinating ground forces, the Panzer spearhead with operations in the air with the Luftwaffe. None of that happens. So Poland becomes the proving ground. And actually, they discover that there's lots of things that don't work and lots of things that are wrong. But it's flying in the face of all military convention that they, he does this without any kind of warning. And even by the 1st of September, where there's been this kind of sort of 5-day delay at the last-minute negotiations. The last-minute negotiations are thrust upon Hitler by people like Goering and by Mussolini and the Italians going, oh my God, don't do this. There's got to be a solution. Hitler's absolutely jumping at the bit.
Well, in that case, from a dark militaristic perspective, his bet paid off.
Well, except that it ended in ruins in May 1945 with total collapse of Germany. So you could say the worst decision he ever made was going into Poland in September 1939. Depends which way you look at it. But I mean, yes, it's successful in that, Poland's overrun in 18 days.
And there's so many counterfactuals here.
But I mean, if you were to say to Hitler on the 30th of April, as he's sort of taking out the pistol from his holster on his sofa in the Führerbunker and going, so Adolf, 1st of September 1939, still backing yourself on that one? I mean, he might have a different view.
The guy's insane and full of blunder, so he probably would have said, yeah, do it all over again.
Yeah, I'm sure he would have done as well.
The conquest. Poland was not a mistake. Soviet Union was not a mistake.
No.
It's just some of the
other people I was let down by people not being strong enough.
Yeah, the Prussian generals are all...
Yeah, of course. That's exactly what he'd say. It wasn't my fault.
He might have quietly done some different decisions about Barbarossa. Maybe the timing would be different.
Maybe that all-out central thrust rather than kind of splitting it into three. Yeah.
But he was very sure, it seems like, maybe you can correct me, that Britain and France would still carry on with appeasement even after he invaded Poland.
Absolutely. He was completely convinced by it. There was clearly a kind of sort of 10 to 15% level of doubt, but what the heck, I'm going to do it anyway. He ratcheted himself up into such a lather of kind of, this is the moment. I have to do it now. This is fate. I'm 50 and I could be taken out by an assassin's bullet. I've got this important life work that I've got to do. We've got to get on with it now. There could be no more delay. This is my mission. This is our mission of the German people. And either the German people have got the will and the spirit to be able to pull it off, or, I was wrong and therefore, we don't deserve to be 1,000-year right. We don't deserve to be the master race. Black or white. Us or them, either or. It's the same all the time.